So it's time for our second installment of this new Hebrews series that I'm so excited to teach on. And in our last video, we basically gave the introduction. We set up what it is we're going to see in Hebrews chapter 11. We can't do Hebrews chapter 11 without really going back to Hebrews chapter 10 and remembering what what it set up this conversation. And so in that last video, we talked about that inclusio, and there's an argument of Hebrews 1 through 10, and that argument comes to a close, and it leads into kind of this, it's longer than, and after this resolution to this larger teaching in the book of Hebrews. And so in that last video, we really talked about how the theme of Hebrews is a theme of perseverance. That basically the writer of Hebrews is saying, this is who Jesus is. This is what Jesus has come and done. This is how this is the huge significant deal that we're a part of. This is atonement. This is sacrifice. This is priesthood. Jesus is our faithful and merciful high priest. And if this is all true, we can't simply throw it away. We can't shrink back. We can't give up. We have to persevere. So this whole argument in Hebrews, this inclusio argument, was made so that the author could essentially say what the theme is. They're making this argument to make their concluding point. And the concluding point of Hebrews is we have to persevere. The book of Hebrews is being written to a Hebraic Jewish audience, a Jesus-following Jewish audience, who was experiencing, on some level, some intense persecution. You could see, depending on where you're going to place the book of Hebrews historically, you could see maybe different what is the persecution exactly? Could be a few different things. I think that it's likely that what's being referenced here is largely an imperial persecution. The temple, in my mind, I date this right after the destruction of the temple, within a handful of years, within a decade probably, of the destruction of the temple in AD 70. And so if that's the case, what you have here is an imperial persecution. The temple's just been destroyed. Judaism is largely under attack, literal and metaphorical attack. They're trying to reorient. What does it mean where's their identity found as a Jewish people? All those kinds of things. It could be that the persecution is this Jewish community that's trying to follow Jesus, and the persecution they're getting from even their larger Jewish community that's saying that's not what we're doing, we're not on the Jesus train. It could be both, or maybe even other things combined. It could be, but this Jewish Jesus following community, this group, this community of Jesus following Jews, is going through an intense time of quite literal, quite physical, quite material persecution. And it's causing them to wonder whether or not following the gospel is worth it. Is this worth it? Because I don't seem to be getting anything out of it. It's not serving me well. My brothers, my sisters, my cousins, my friends, they're dying, literally dying for their faith. This seems like an exercise in futility. It seems like there's no way that this is going to end well. I'm going to say that again. It seems like there's no way this is going to end well. Like, how could this be what God is up to? How could this be what God is up to? And the writer of Hebrews makes this whole case, 10 chapters of Hebrews, of who Jesus was and what he did and what he's up to. And the writer of Hebrews says you can't give up. Because the thing that Jesus is up to is too big. It's too grand. It's too supreme. It's too glorious to just walk away from it and shrink back. And that's the transition between the inclusio of Hebrews 1 through 10 and this afterward, this conclusion. Therefore, it's all of these therefores in Hebrews. There's an argument being made here. Therefore, we can't, if that's who Jesus is and what Jesus has done, we can't give up, right? So we did that. We did that in the last video. We did the context. We did the setup. Now what I want to do in this video is I still want I want to stay at the end of I want to go back and look at that very end of chapter 10 and trickle into the first reference that we need to see in Hebrews 11. And we'll do that. So I want to go back to chapter 10 in the book of Hebrews. We already read this in the last video. But I want to go back to verse 36, because there's a quotation here which baffles a lot of people. And I don't think it needs to baffle us, and we'll see what you think by the time we're done. But here's how it reads. It reads like this: you need to persevere, so that when you have done the will of God, you will receive what he has promised. For in just a little while, he who is coming will come and will not delay, but my righteous one will live by faith, and I take no pleasure in the one who shrinks back. But we do not belong to those who shrink back and are destroyed, but to those who have faith and are saved. There's a quotation in verse 37 and 38. It reads like this. I'll read it again. For in just a little while he who is coming will come and will not delay, but my righteous one will live by faith, and I take no pleasure in the one who shrinks back. And it's a quotation, and it's kind of obvious it's a quotation in the translation, in the manuscript, and yet we wrestle with what is that a quotation of? I think it is, without a doubt, a quotation from Habakkuk chapter 2. Now, when we go back and look at Habakkuk 2, we're going to say, there are some similarities, but that's not what it says, Marty. That's not what it says. And yet what the writer of Hebrews is doing here is what a lot of writers of the New Testament are doing, even more so in Hebrews because of the Greek thinking, the Hellenistic thinking that's in Hebrews. The writer is quoting the Septuagint, and it's almost a direct quote out of the Septuagint. And the writer is purposely quoting the Septuagint, and the writer happens to be hinging their point not on the Hebrew Bible, but they're actually hinging their point on the Greek. What is the Septuagint? The Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures. Translated by the Jews, was commissioned. There's a whole story behind that. But it's the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. And the writer here is using the Greek translation and actually hinging their point poetically, cleverly hinging their point on what you find in the Greek translation. And I think the writer is doing that because that's what their audience is familiar with the Septuagint. The audience is using the Septuagint in their synagogue every week. The audience is a more Greek-thinking, Hellenistic, Judaized audience, a more Hellenistic Jewish audience. And they're using the Septuagint. And so the author here is using their scriptures to make a point out of their own translation, out of their own scriptures. I think it's a brilliant, brilliant move. But I want to go back and show you what's being quoted. So this is a quote coming from Habakkuk 2. Let me see if I can find it. I put a bookmark in here somewhere. Let's not lose our place in Hebrews. Habakkuk 2 says this. The Lord, Habakkuk 2, verse 2. Actually, I'll start in Habakkuk 2, verse 2. And the Lord replied, write down the revelation and make it plain on tablets, so that a herald may run with it. For the revelation awaits an appointed time. It speaks of the end, and it will not prove false. Though it linger, wait for it. It will certainly come and will not delay. There's the phrase that is almost word for word what's said in Hebrews. Now, what's said in Hebrews is not that the vision will come, but that he will come. However, in the Hebrew, the word for he and the word for it are the same word. And so I think the author gets to toy with this Septuagint version because of how the play on words is between he makes the it a vision and connects the it to a he in Jesus, which is hopefully you're following that in your mind. Hopefully that makes sense. It's a brilliant move by the author. Takes the vision that's being quoted in Habakkuk 2, makes the vision realized. Jesus is coming and will come without a delay. The vision will come without a delay. And then it says this, see, the enemy is puffed up. His desires are not upright, but the righteous person will live by faithfulness. Indeed, wine betrays him. He is arrogant and never at rest, because he is as greedy as the grave, and like death is never satisfied. He gathers to himself all nations and takes captive all peoples. Now, here's what's interesting. You say, but that's not what's quoted in Hebrews. But in the Septuagint translation, the beginning of verse 4, see, the enemy is puffed up. His desires are not upright, his desires are not upright. That is the section that's quoted. You'll notice that what the writer of Hebrews does is the writer of Hebrews flips the two pieces of verse 4 in Habakkuk. And the writer does that, it seems, on purpose. But the quotation matches the Septuagint. And I take no pleasure in the one who shrinks back, is how that verse in the Septuagint is translated. The enemy is puffed up and his desires are not upright, but the righteous person will live by faithfulness. So it seems that the author is playing off of the Septuagint. Now here's why I don't want you to get lost and confused in the Septuagint. What I'm trying to make, here's the big idea. Let me just skip to the point. The point is that the writer of Hebrews is without a doubt in my mind quoting Habakkuk 2. So why would the writer of Hebrews be quoting Habakkuk 2? Because what is Habakkuk 2 talking about? Habakkuk's talking about a world where they're undergoing what? Persecution. The writer of Habakkuk is talking about a world where he's like, the writer is literally saying, God, I don't understand it. Like, I don't understand. God, like the writer just got done saying to God, I don't accept this. I demand an answer. I'm going to climb up in my watchtower and I'm going to wait for God to answer my question. This doesn't make any sense. How could this be? The writer of Habakkuk is in almost the exact same spot that the audience of Hebrews is in. They're looking around at a world that's falling apart, a world where they're experiencing persecution, the same kinds of imperial persecution, probably, that Habakkuk experienced in the world of Babylon. So the writer of Hebrews are in the world of Rome. Habakkuk was in the world of Babylon, but they're experiencing very, very similar things. And the writer of Habakkuk is like, I don't get this. How could this possibly end up where you want it to end up, God? This isn't going to work. And the people of Hebrews are sitting in the same, how could this isn't working for us? We're dying for our faith. We're getting nothing out of this. And the writer of Hebrews is trying to say, you got to stick with it. Well, what was the lesson of Habakkuk? The lesson of Habakkuk was God telling Habakkuk, listen, Habakkuk, I got this. And I know that you won't, like if you go back and read Habakkuk, maybe I'll put our Habakkuk episode from the podcast. I'll put that in the description of the video here so that you can go back and watch that. The message of Habakkuk is, listen, God says, I'm doing something that you wouldn't understand even if I told you. Like, you don't understand how this is all working out. There's no way you understand this cosmological thing that I'm doing in the world. But you hang in there. You persevere, Habakkuk. And this is the message that Habakkuk will hear. And it will drive him in Habakkuk 3 to sing this song of trust and faith in God. But the phrase that often gets quoted in Jewish conversation, one of the most common verses that was a part of Second Temple Judaism, was a verse out of Habakkuk, and it was that verse that was quoted. The righteous will live by faithfulness. And the Jewish conversation essentially said that the message in Habakkuk is, if you will devote yourselves, if you will be faithful, if you will walk God's path, if you will live God's way, if you will live out the commandments no matter what your circumstances, if you will remain faithful, you will find life. That's how the rabbis understood the righteous will live by faith. They will find life because they are faithful. They will find life in their faithfulness. And here's the writer of Hebrews quoting that verse without a doubt, at the very least. Even if you're like, I don't understand the Septuagint, I don't think that's actually the quote there, doesn't seem like it's word for me, I looked up the Septuagint, yada. Maybe you're not there. That's totally fine. But without a doubt, for sure, the writer of Hebrews is quoting that verse that's so important. The righteous person will live by faithfulness. Because that's the writer of Hebrews' great point. We have to continue to be faithful. No matter what's happening around us, no matter what our circumstances are, we will find life in our faithfulness. I know it seems like it's not working for us. I know it seems like we've got friends and family, people who are dying for their faith. I know that when we look out, we can't see at all how this would ever work, but we will find life in our faithfulness because God is up to something, just like in Habakkuk. God is up to something. We couldn't even understand it if he told us, but he's up to something. Make no mistake about it. So we can't shrink back. We can't shrink back. We can't shrink back. We can't give up. We can't lose our faith. We have to be faithful because we will find life in our faithfulness. We have to persevere. So with that, let us hear the beginning of Hebrews chapter 11. This is all the setup. The setup is the writer of Hebrews saying we can't give up. We have to persevere. We will find life in our faithfulness. And then the very next verse, forget the big number 11 that's in your Bible. Forget the chapter break. There's no chapter break. Just keep reading. We can't shrink back. We do not belong to those who shrink back and are destroyed, but to those who have faith and are saved. Now, faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. What was it that Habakkuk experienced? Habakkuk had to be exhorted by God to have faith. Habakkuk was being invited to trust in things that he couldn't understand, to be confident in things that he could not see. He couldn't see how God was ever going to work through the Babylonians. How could that be? We're going to be destroyed. How could that be? And Habakkuk's this isn't some abstract argument in Hebrews 11 coming out of nowhere that starts with a declaration of what faith is. That's usually where we start this chapter. We start the chapter in Hebrews 11:1. Now faith, and we talk about faith in this abstract theological form. But for the writer of Hebrews, this is not an abstract argument. It is very concrete. It's coming out of chapter 10 where he's arguing about, or she, we don't know who the writer of Hebrews is, where the author is arguing about what faith looks like and how we have to persevere. Perseverance is based on faith. The kind of faith that can be confident in things that it doesn't even see. Like that statement has an introduction to it. That statement rings of Habakkuk. That statement is connected to a context of suffering and a call to perseverance. Faith is being confident in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. I know it's hard. I know that you're struggling. I know that you're sitting in the middle of persecution. But faith is being confident that God is up to something and that faithfulness brings life and we can't shrink back and give up. And then this is what the ancients were commended for. And then the first statement. See, whenever I said this in the last video, whenever I read Hebrews 11, it was the Hall of Faith. Here's all these people who were awesome. They were heroes. They were like the best at faith. Just like the Hall of Fame for football, they're like the best football players. But here, the Hall of Faith, I always assumed that this was the best faith people, right? But look at the first one. By faith, we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what was seen was not made out of what was visible. I'll read that again. By faith, we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. So God made creation, the things that we can see, the things that are real, the material things, out of things that couldn't be seen. God made material creation out of immaterial, chaotic nothingness, tohu vavohu in Genesis 1. God made material creation out of the immaterial. What this does is it throws a wrench in Hebrews 11 if we're viewing it as a list of all the people who had amazing faith, because creation isn't a person, and creation doesn't have faith. And yet it does fit perfectly if I see the larger conversation that the author of Hebrews is having. The author of Hebrews is saying, listen, This is what Jesus is up to in the world, and we can't give up. We can't be people that shrink back. We know that life, real life, will come from our faithfulness. So we can't give up. We have to persevere. Because that's what faith looks like. Faith looks like trusting in the things that we can't see. Faith looks like being confident in things that sometimes make no sense. How could God be at work here? And then the author says, well, we know that God made all of creation, everything we've ever experienced. God made it out of nothing. Like, how logical is that? Like, all of creation, the things that are visible, was made out of the invisible. That doesn't make any sense. How could you have ever seen, pun intended, how could you have ever seen that happening? You couldn't have. It makes no sense from where we sit. And yet God knows what he's up to. God knows what he's capable of. God knows what can be done. And what are we left with? Faith. So it seems to me that the premise of Hebrews chapter 11 is not going to be a list of all these people who are like just heroes because their faith was so good. I think the point of Hebrews chapter 11, and we'll see if this bears itself out, but the point of Hebrews chapter 11 seems to be that faith is remembering that the things that God does are way beyond our ability to see and comprehend. We could never see it, we could never understand it, we could never anticipate it, and yet throughout the ages, this is what God's done. And look at what's happened throughout the story of God's people when the characters in the story remained faithful and trusted that God was up to something they could have never understood. And God shows up, and because of that, the story moves forward. And the writer of Hebrews is going to say, and therefore we can't give up. I know it looks hopeless, but it's never been hopeless. I know it looks hopeless, but it never has been hopeless. I know it looks like there's no way, but there's always been a way. I know it looks like God's not doing anything, but God is always doing something. And that, the writer of Hebrews says, is faith. We know that all creation exists. All the something exists from nothing, because that's how God works. We know that Habakkuk couldn't see a way, and God said, yeah, you don't see a way. You wouldn't understand the way even if I told you what I was doing. You couldn't even understand it. Habakkuk, just trust that I'm doing something. The writer of Hebrews says this is why we can't give up. This is why we can't give up. This is why we have to persevere. This is why faith is being confident of things that we hope for and an assurance of things we can't see. Because we know that God's doing something. He always has been. So let's go through the story of God. And the writer of Hebrews is going to go through the story of faith. Not because these are the best faithers. I just invented a word. It's not that these are the best faith players that end up in the Hall of Fame. It's that these are the people that experienced the story of God in light of what seems like there's no way, and they discovered that actually there was a way. And so we have to believe the same thing and not give up. We have to overcome. We have to persevere. Hopefully that's the message we'll see, but we'll find out. We're going to move on to the next reference in our next video. We'll see you then.